China just blocked a solution to a problem that hurts China the most, and that doesn't make sense. On April 7th, inside the United Nations Security Council, China and Russia vetoed a resolution related to the Strait of Hormuz. Within minutes, the narrative was already set. China is backing Iran. Russia and China are protecting a destabilizing regime. They're putting the global economy at risk. It's clean that it's simple, and it makes intuitive sense. But here's the part that doesn't sit right with me. China is the largest buyer of Iranian oil in the world. A huge portion of that oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So if that route is disrupted, China doesn't benefit. It loses, possibly more than anyone else. So why would the country with the most to lose be the one stopping the solution? And this is where things start to get uncomfortable. Because there's an argument from Jiang Xueqin that suggests we might be looking at this completely the wrong way. Let's slow this down for a second. Because before we get into Jiang's framework, I think it's worth sitting with the basic contradiction. China imports somewhere between 10 to 11 million barrels of oil every single day. A significant portion of that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. That's not a minor dependency. That's a structural one. If the strait is disrupted, energy prices rise, supply chains tighten, and China, as the world's largest manufacturing hub, feels that pressure almost immediately. So from a purely short-term perspective, the logic seems obvious. China should want stability. It should want the strait open. It should be pushing harder than anyone to resolve the situation quickly. And yet, it vetoed the resolution. Not once, multiple times, even after the language of the resolution was softened. And this is where most explanations stop. They default to something simple. China is backing Iran. Or China is opposing the West, which might be partially true. But it doesn't really answer the question. Because even if China prefers Iran over Western pressure, that still doesn't explain why it would accept direct economic pain in the process. And this is the point where Jiang's argument starts. Not with an answer, but with a shift in how you're supposed to look at the problem. Because according to him, the mistake isn't in the conclusion. It's in the time frame. We're looking at this like a short-term decision. He's looking at it like a long-term system. And if you change that lens, the same action starts to look very different. So this is where Jiang's argument starts to take shape. And I think the easiest way to understand it is to stop asking whether China's decision makes sense and start asking what assumptions we're using to judge it. Because if you're looking at this through a short-term lens, the conclusion feels obvious. Disruption in the strait hurts China. Blocking a resolution that could stabilize the situation looks irrational or, at the very least, self-defeating. That's the baseline assumption. And Jiang's entire framework begins by rejecting it. Not completely, but enough to shift the perspective. Because according to him, China is not optimizing for short-term stability. It's optimizing for long-term positioning. And those are not the same thing. In fact, they often point in opposite directions. Short-term thinking prioritizes immediate outcomes. Lower prices, stable supply, predictable flows. Long-term thinking, at least in the way Jiang describes it, is less concerned with stability and more concerned with structure. Who controls what, who depends on whom, who has leverage when things stop working the way they're supposed to. And if you start looking at the situation through that lens, the veto doesn't necessarily look like a mistake anymore. It starts to look like a trade-off, accepting short-term disruption in exchange for something else, something less visible, but potentially more important over time. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is the point where analysis like this can become too neat, too clean. It's very easy to take a complicated situation and impose a kind of strategic coherence on it that may not fully exist. But at the same time, ignoring the possibility that countries operate on longer timelines doesn't really hold up either, especially in the case of China. So Jiang's argument is not that China wants a disruption. It's that China is willing to tolerate it, because what the disruption does to the broader system might actually work in its favor. And this is where the framing shifts. This is no longer about supporting Iran, or opposing the West, or even about the strait itself. It becomes a question of how global systems behave under stress. What happens when a critical choke point becomes unstable? What breaks What adapts? What gets exposed? And more importantly, who benefits from that exposure? Because if the answer to that question isn't obvious, then the initial narrative starts to feel a little incomplete, not necessarily wrong, but simplified in a way that misses something deeper. And this is the part where Jiang's framework starts to layer. Because once you accept that possibility, that this might not be about the immediate outcome, you can start to ask a different kind of question. Not why did China block this, but what would have happened if it didn't? So let's take that question seriously. What would have actually happened if the resolution had passed? On the surface, it sounds straightforward. Restore freedom of navigation. Reopen the strait. Stabilize global energy flows. But Jiang's argument focuses on something much more specific. Not the stated goal of the resolution, but the mechanism behind it. Because buried inside the language of that proposal was a phrase that shows up often in international diplomacy. All necessary means. And in everyday language, that sounds vague. But in diplomatic terms, it's not vague at all. It's permission. Permission to use force. Permission to escalate. Permission to take military action with a degree of international legitimacy behind it. And that distinction matters more than it seems. Because there's a difference between using power and using power with approval. If the United States, or any coalition aligned with it, intervenes militarily without UN backing, the action is still powerful, but it's contested, debated, framed differently depending on who you ask. If that same action is backed by a UN Security Council resolution, it changes the context. It becomes normalized, justified, much harder to challenge at the level of international law and global perception. And this is where Jiang's reasoning becomes more concrete, because from his perspective, the resolution wasn't just about reopening the strait. It was about granting legitimacy to whoever enforced that reopening, most likely the United States and its allies. Now, if that happens, the outcome isn't just a restored shipping route. It's a demonstration, a very visible one, that the United States can still step in, control a critical global choke point, and do so with international approval. And if you follow that logic, the implications go beyond the specific conflict, because control over energy routes has always been one of the foundations of global power. Whoever secures the flow of oil influences the system that depends on it. And if that role is publicly reaffirmed through a UN-backed intervention, it reinforces something that China has been trying to reduce for decades: dependence. Not just economic dependence, but structural dependence. Dependence on a system where key arteries of global trade can be stabilized or disrupted by a single dominant power. Now again, I think it's important not to overstate this. Passing a resolution does not instantly give total control. It doesn't guarantee success. And it doesn't eliminate resistance. But it does shift the baseline. It creates a framework where one side operates with recognized authority, and the other doesn't. And in geopolitics, that kind of asymmetry matters, because it shapes how other countries respond, who they align with, what they consider legitimate. So if you look at it from Jiang's perspective, the veto is not just blocking an action, it's blocking a validation, blocking a moment where U.S. power is not only exercised, but endorsed. And that changes how the move is interpreted. Because instead of asking why China would block a solution, you start asking what that solution would have actually strengthened, and whether preventing that might have been the real objective. So that's the first layer in Jiang's framework, legitimacy. But according to him, that's not even the most important part. The deeper layer has to do with something much larger, the system that sits underneath global energy flows. Because when we talk about oil moving through the Strait of Hormuz, we're not just talking about physical shipments. We're talking about the financial architecture built around those shipments. And for the last several decades, that architecture has been centered on one thing: the U.S. dollar. Most global oil transactions are conducted in dollars, which means that if you want to buy energy at scale, you need access to dollars. And that creates a kind of built-in demand for the currency, not because countries prefer it ideologically, but because the system requires it. And over time, that requirement translates into influence. It allows the United States to finance deficits more easily. IT reinforces demand for U.S. financial assets. The IT ties global energy markets into a dollar-based network that feeds back into American economic power. So when people talk about the petrodollar system, this is what they mean, not just oil price in dollars, but a loop. Energy flows, dollar demand, capital flows back into the U.S., reinforcing the system. Now, under stable conditions, that loop holds. It's not perfect, but it's durable. But Jiang's argument is that instability, especially at a choke point like Hormuz, starts to stress that loop because disruption doesn't just affect supply. It affects reliability, and reliability is what keeps systems like this intact. If the flow of oil becomes uncertain, delayed, or politically contested, countries start looking for ways to reduce that uncertainty, not necessarily all at once, but gradually, experimentally. And this is where his argument takes a bigger leap. Because according to Jiang, a prolonged disruption doesn't just create economic pain. It creates pressure for alternatives. Alternative payment systems, alternative settlement currencies, alternative supply routes that don't rely on the same infrastructure. And under normal circumstances, those alternatives struggle to gain traction. The existing system is too entrenched, too efficient, too widely accepted. But under stress, the calculus changes. Because what was previously inefficient might now be acceptable if it offers stability. What was previously marginal might now be viable if it reduces exposure. And this is where China enters the picture more directly. For years, China has been building pieces of an alternative system. Not a full replacement. Not yet, but components. Yuan-denominated energy transactions. Cross-border payment systems outside traditional Western channels. Energy partnerships that bypass some of the most vulnerable maritime routes. Individually, these pieces don't challenge the system, but collectively, under the right conditions, they start to matter more. And this is Jiang's core claim at this layer, that instability in Hormuz doesn't just hurt China. It accelerates a process that China has already been preparing for. A slow shift away from a system where energy, finance, and geopolitical influence are tightly linked through the dollar. Now, this is where I think it's important to be cautious, because this kind of argument can easily become too deterministic. The dollar system is deeply embedded. It's not something that unravels quickly. And short-term disruptions don't automatically translate into long-term structural change. But at the same time, systems don't usually break all at once. They erode, gradually, through moments of stress that expose their vulnerabilities. And if you accept that possibility, even partially, then the veto starts to look different again. Not as a move to protect instability for its own sake, but as a move that allows that instability to persist, long enough to create pressure, long enough to make alternatives more attractive, long enough to shift behavior at the margins. And in systems like this, the margins matter, because that's where change begins, not in a sudden collapse, but in small adjustments that accumulate over time. And if that's what's happening here, then this isn't just about a waterway. It's about what happens to the system built around it when it stops working perfectly. Up to this point, Jiang's argument depends on one critical assumption, that China can afford to absorb the disruption, because if it can't, then everything else starts to fall apart. You can't play a long-term game if the short-term pressure forces you to stop. So the question becomes, is China actually prepared for something like this? Or is that just part of the narrative? According to Jiang, this is where a lot of people underestimate how China approaches risk, because most countries optimize for efficiency. China, at least in its framing, has spent the last decade optimizing for resilience. And those are not the same thing. Efficiency minimizes cost under stable conditions. Resilience accepts higher cost in exchange for the ability to function when conditions are not stable. So instead of asking whether disruption hurts China, the more relevant question might be how much disruption it can tolerate. And this is where he starts pointing to a series of developments that, taken together, suggest a kind of preparation, not necessarily for this exact scenario, but for something like it. For one, China has been building strategic petroleum reserves at a scale that isn't always visible in headline numbers, stockpiling energy, creating buffers, so that temporary disruptions don't immediately translate into systemic shocks. Then there's diversification. China doesn't rely on a single supplier or a single route. It imports from the Middle East, from Russia, from Africa. It has been actively reducing the risk that any one choke point can fully constrain its supply. There's also infrastructure. Projects like the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor are often discussed in terms of development or trade, but they also serve another function. They create alternative pathways, routes that bypass some of the most exposed maritime channels, not completely replacing them, but reducing dependence. And then there's domestic capacity. China has invested heavily in energy production at home, solar, wind, nuclear, not just as environmental policy, but as a form of strategic insulation. Because every unit of energy produced domestically is one less unit that needs to move through a vulnerable external system. Now, when you put all of this together, Jiang's conclusion becomes clearer. China isn't immune to disruption, but it's less exposed than it used to be, and maybe less exposed than some of its competitors, which changes how it experiences pressure. Because pressure without buffers forces reaction. Pressure with buffers creates options. You can wait. You can adapt. You can choose not to resolve a situation immediately if resolving it would reinforce a system you're trying to move away from. Now again, I think this is where it's important to stay grounded. Preparation doesn't eliminate risk. It reduces it. And it's very difficult to measure, from the outside, exactly how much capacity China actually has to absorb sustained disruption. There's a difference between planning for instability and living through it over an extended period. But even with that uncertainty, the framework introduces something important, a different way of thinking about vulnerability. Instead of assuming that disruption automatically weakens everyone equally, it suggests that the impact is uneven, that some systems are built to endure longer than others. And if that's true, then the question of who benefits from delay becomes more complicated, because it's no longer just about who is hurt. It's about who is hurt more slowly, who can absorb the pressure long enough for something else to change. And this is where Jiang's argument starts to extend beyond economics, because if China is relatively prepared, then the veto isn't just about allowing instability. It's about controlling the timeline of that instability, letting it continue on terms that may not look favorable in the short run, but could reshape the system over a longer horizon. And whether or not that's actually what's happening, it's a difficult possibility to ignore. Up to this point, Jiang's framework has focused on systems, energy flows, financial structures, strategic preparation. But there's another layer that doesn't show up in data the same way. And yet, it shapes outcomes just as much. Narrative, how events are interpreted, how actions are justified, how different parts of the world decide who is acting within the rules and who isn't. Because in modern geopolitics, power isn't just exercised, it's explained. And those explanations matter. Now, inside the United Nations, when China and Russia vetoed the resolution, their stated reasoning was relatively straightforward. They argued that the proposal did not address the root causes of the conflict, that it focused on symptoms rather than origins, that it risked escalating the situation rather than stabilizing it. And whether or not you agree with that argument, it introduces a different framing, one where the issue isn't simply reopening a shipping route, but questioning the sequence of events that led to the disruption in the first place. Because if you follow that line of reasoning, the story becomes less linear. It's no longer disruption, resolution, restoration. It becomes escalation, response, proposed intervention, further escalation. And in that version of the story, the resolution doesn't just look like a solution. It looks like a continuation of the conflict, under a different form. Now, this matters because not every country interprets these events through the same lens. Across parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, there has been a long-standing skepticism toward how international rules are applied, not necessarily a rejection of the rules themselves, but a perception that enforcement is uneven, that similar actions are treated differently depending on who is involved. And over time, that perception accumulates. It shapes how new events are understood. So when China positions its veto as a defense of sovereignty, or as a refusal to endorse escalation without addressing underlying causes, that message resonates in certain parts of the world, not everywhere, but enough to matter. because it aligns with existing doubts. It reinforces a narrative that many countries already find plausible. And this is where Jiang's argument becomes less about what China is doing and more about how it is being seen. Because if China can position itself, even partially, as a country that resists selective enforcement, that questions unilateral escalation, that emphasizes sovereignty, then it gains something that isn't measured in military strength, credibility, or at least a form of it, relative credibility. And at the same time, the United States, which often frames itself as a defender of a rules-based order, faces a more complicated perception in this context, not necessarily because its position is invalid, but because a sequence of events can be interpreted in multiple ways. And in a fragmented information environment, those interpretations don't converge. They diverge. Different regions, different audiences, different historical experiences, all producing different conclusions from the same set of facts. So what you end up with is not a single narrative, but competing ones. And those narratives don't stay confined to media coverage. They influence alignment, partnerships, trust, which countries choose to cooperate more closely, and which ones start exploring alternatives. Now, I think this is where it's easy to become overly cynical, to assume that narrative is just manipulation, but that's not quite right. Narratives are not just constructed, they are received. They only work if they connect with something that already exists in the audience. And in this case, there is already a foundation, a history of uneven enforcement, a perception of imbalance. So when China acts in a way that can be interpreted as resisting that imbalance, even if the motivations are more strategic than principled, the effect is still real. And this is Jiang's point at this layer. The veto doesn't just block a resolution. It shapes how the entire situation is understood. It shifts the conversation from who is causing the problem to who gets to define the rules. And once that question enters a frame, the dynamics of the conflict start to change. Not immediately, not visibly, but in ways that accumulate over time. Because perception doesn't decide outcomes on its own, but it influences the environment in which those outcomes unfold. And in that sense, it becomes part of the strategy. If you follow Jiang's argument all the way through, it eventually leads to a much larger claim that what we're seeing here isn't just a dispute over a shipping route or even a regional conflict. It's a signal about how global power is starting to behave differently. Because for a long time, the international system operated with a kind of center of gravity. After the Cold War, that center was the United States. Not just militarily, but institutionally. If the U.S. wanted to intervene, it often could. If it wanted to build coalitions, it usually succeeded. And if it needed international legitimacy, institutions like the United Nations often aligned with that outcome. Not always, but often enough that the pattern became familiar. And over time, that familiarity started to feel like structure, like the system itself. But according to Jiang, that structure has been changing. Gradually, unevenly, but consistently. And what happened in this case, this veto, is one of those moments where the change becomes visible. Because what you have here is not a procedural disagreement. It's a limit, a visible, enforceable limit on what the United States can do through international institutions. Two other major powers looked at a proposal and said no, not temporarily, not conditionally, but decisively. And that matters because it shows that the system is no longer operating in a unipolar way. There isn't a single actor that can translate its preferences into outcomes without resistance. There are now multiple centers of power, each capable of blocking, shaping, or redirecting decisions at the highest level. And that creates a different kind of environment, one where outcomes are negotiated, not assumed, where legitimacy is contested, not granted, where even the most powerful states have to operate within constraints that are more visible than they used to be. Now, I think it's important to be careful with how far we take this, because it's easy to jump from a single event to a sweeping conclusion, to say that this proves the world has fully transitioned into a multipolar system, and that might be premature. Power is still unevenly distributed. The United States still holds significant advantages across multiple domains. But what Jiang is pointing to isn't a completed transition. It's a direction, a trend, A gradual shift from a system where one power could largely define the rules to one where those rules are increasingly negotiated, challenged, blocked, and reshaped. And the veto becomes significant in that context, not because it changes everything overnight, but because it illustrates the new dynamic. A dynamic where institutions like the UN Security Council are no longer predictable extensions of a single power's influence. They are arenas, spaces where competing visions of order intersect and sometimes collide. And when that happens, the outcome is not determined by precedent. It's determined by the balance of power in that moment, which is exactly what we saw here. So if Jiang is right, then this isn't just about what China prevented. It's about what it demonstrated, that the system itself is becoming less centralized, more contested, more resistant to unilateral action. And if that continues, then moments like this may become less surprising, not because they are less significant, but because they are more representative of how the system now works. So if you take all of these layers together, legitimacy, financial systems, preparation, narrative, and structural shifts, Jiang's argument starts to look less like a series of separate points and more like a single framework, a way of analyzing power that doesn't focus on one dimension at a time, but on several simultaneously. And the way he breaks it down is actually quite simple. 4 dimensions: military, economic, political, and narrative. Now, the interesting part is not any one of these on its own. It's how they interact. Because in this case, China hasn't deployed military force. It hasn't entered the conflict directly. And yet, through the veto, it has shaped the military dimension of the situation by preventing the United States from obtaining international authorization to act more decisively. So, even without engaging militarily, it has influenced what military options are available to others. Then there's the economic dimension. The veto contributes to prolonging uncertainty around energy flows, which, in Jiang's view, creates pressure on the dollar-based system tied to those flows. Not an immediate shift, but a gradual one, where instability encourages experimentation, and experimentation opens the door to alternatives. At the same time, China's own economic positioning, its reserves, its diversification, its internal capacity, allows it to absorb some of that pressure differently than other actors. Not pain-free, but not equally distributed either. Then there's the political dimension. By framing the veto in terms of sovereignty and restraint, China positions itself in a way that resonates with parts of the international community that are already skeptical of Western-led interventions. That doesn't mean universal support, but it creates alignment where it might not have existed before. It builds relationships, or at least strengthens certain perceptions. And finally, the narrative dimension, which might be the most subtle, but also the most persistent, because narratives don't resolve quickly. They accumulate. They shape how future events are interpreted. They influence which explanations feel credible and which ones don't. So when you look at all 4 dimensions together, Jiang's conclusion becomes clearer. This wasn't just a defensive move. It wasn't just about blocking something undesirable. It was an action that, at least in its framework, produces effects across multiple layers at the same time. Military constraints, economic pressure, political positioning, narrative influence, all from a single decision. Now, again, I think it's important to keep some distance from how clean that sounds. Real-world systems are messy. Outcomes are rarely this coordinated. And it's possible that some of these effects are incidental rather than intentional. But even if that's the case, the framework itself is still useful because it forces you to look beyond the most visible layer, to ask not just what happened, but what changed as a result across different domains, at different speeds. And when you do that, the event starts to look less isolated, less like a one-off decision, and more like part of a broader pattern. One where influence is exercised not just through direct action, but through shaping the conditions under which others act. And whether or not that's exactly what China intended, it's a way of looking at the situation that's difficult to ignore once you've seen it. At this point, there's an obvious counterargument. Even if Jiang's framework makes sense, even if the veto creates all these layered effects, there's still a basic reality. China is being hurt by the situation. Energy disruption isn't abstract. It has real costs, higher prices, supply uncertainty, pressure on industry. So the argument goes like this. China can't sustain this indefinitely. Eventually, it would have to support reopening the strait. And at first glance, that sounds reasonable, maybe even obvious. But Jiang reframes the question in a way that changes how you think about it. He doesn't ask whether China can endure this forever. He asks something else. Who runs out of time first? And that's a very different question, because once you look at it that way, you're no longer evaluating absolute resilience. You're comparing rates of pressure, how quickly different systems start to strain under the same conditions. Now, if you look at the United States through that lens, the costs are not just economic. They're also political. Sustained instability affects markets. It affects energy prices. It affects public perception. And over time, that translates into pressure on decision makers, on administrations, on legislatures, on alliances that are expected to hold together under stress. There's also the question of resources, military deployments, operational costs, stockpiles. None of these are infinite. And while the United States has significant capacity, it also operates within a system where prolonged strain has visible consequences. Now compare that to Iran, a country that has spent decades operating under sanctions, pressure, and constraint. Its system is not designed for stability. It's designed for endurance. It doesn't need to win quickly. It needs to avoid collapsing. And that creates a different relationship with time. Then there's China, which, according to Jiang's framework, sits somewhere in between. It's not unaffected, but it's buffered. It has reserves, alternative supply arrangements, domestic capacity, and perhaps most importantly, a political structure that can absorb economic pressure differently than systems that are more immediately responsive to public sentiment. So when you put all of this together, time itself becomes a variable, not just a backdrop, a factor that shapes outcomes. Because if one side experiences pressure faster than another, then delay starts to have direction. It starts to favor one side over the other, not because that side is winning outright, but because it is losing more slowly. And this is Jiang's underlying point. The veto doesn't resolve the situation. It extends it. It stretches the timeline. And in doing so, it changes the balance of pressure. Now, whether that balance actually favors China in the long run is still uncertain. There are too many variables, too many unknowns. But the framework introduces something important, a way of thinking about conflict that isn't just about capability, but about endurance, about how systems behave not in moments, but over time. And once you start looking at it that way, the question of who benefits becomes harder to answer quickly, which in itself might be part of the point. So after going through all of this, I keep coming back to a very simple question. Is Jiang right? And I don't think there's an easy answer to that, because on one hand, the framework is compelling. It connects different layers in a way that feels coherent. It explains behavior that otherwise looks contradictory. And once you see it that way, it's hard to unsee it. But at the same time, there's a risk in frameworks like this. They can make complex systems look more intentional than they actually are, more coordinated, more controlled. And reality doesn't always work like that. Countries don't always act according to a single, unified strategy. Decisions are influenced by internal politics, incomplete information, competing interests. Sometimes outcomes align with long-term strategy, and sometimes they don't. So it's possible that what looks like a calculated move is partly that, and partly something else, a reaction, an adaptation, a decision made under constraints that we don't fully see from the outside. And that uncertainty matters, because without it, it becomes too easy to turn analysis into certainty. To move from this could be what's happening to this is what's happening. And those are not the same thing, at least not yet. So maybe the more useful way to think about this is not to decide whether Jiang is correct, but to treat his framework as one way of seeing the situation, a lens, one that highlights certain dynamics and makes others easier to notice. because whether or not every party's argument holds, it points to something real. That power doesn't operate on a single level anymore. That outcomes are shaped across systems, and that some of the most important moves don't look like moves at all. They look like hesitation, or contradiction, or in this case, a veto that doesn't quite make sense, until you start looking at it differently. And even then, it's not entirely clear. And maybe that's the point. Not that the answer is hidden, but that the system itself is harder to read than we think. That's the framework, not a conclusion, but a way of thinking about what might be happening beneath the surface. If you've been following this closely, I'm curious how you see it, whether this feels like a deliberate strategy or something we might be overinterpreting. Either way, it's probably worth paying attention to what happens next, because if this pattern continues, it won't stay subtle for long. See you in the next one.